Welcome to Postwave. You're here with Eric and Trevor.
Today we're going to be talking about something that's received a lot of press over the last couple of years, and that's the simulation argument that everything we're seeing and everything we're experiencing is just a simulation by some very advanced civilization.
Are we actually going to be talking about that? Or do we actually not exist and we're just a simulation?
I mean, it depends what you mean by exist.
Huh.
So I'd say thinking it counts as existing. As always, but especially for this episode, we'd like to issue a disclaimer that we're just two music teachers who like to talk about highfalutin topics that are usually slightly beyond our area of expertise.
Sometimes greatly.
Sometimes greatly. So if we say anything that's just totally not true or off base, please send us a nice email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com and let us know how to fix it. Thanks so much.
So what is this argument anyway, that everything's a simulation? Why is that?
So actually, it's interesting. I think, myself included, I think most people kind of misunderstand what Nick Bostrom is arguing. So he's not arguing that there's any particular probability involved. Like he's specifically not making a judgment on that. He's just laying out three possibilities, one of which has to be true.
What are those possibilities?
So the first possibility is that every civilization that has ever existed has destroyed themselves before they are able to reach the level of technology where they can create a simulation that's indiscernible from reality. The second one is that every civilization that does reach that level of technology always becomes disinterested in creating that kind of simulation. And the third is that we're living in a simulation. So he says one of those has to be true.
Now, how does he get to that?
It's based on the fact that if even if some technological civilizations produce simulations, those civilizations will produce so many simulations that they'll vastly outnumber the number of real beings. The simulated beings will outnumber the real beings. And so the odds of you being a simulated being are way higher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, unless we destroy ourselves before we create simulations, or advanced civilizations just don't give a shit about creating simulations.
So then if we do have the technology to create simulations, we're almost certainly in a simulation just because of chance.
Right. Although, the interesting twist for me, though, is that you get into the problem of nested simulations. And that's an open question as to whether that could even happen and how far down it could go. And it's not necessary for the simulation argument that you can have nested simulations. Because it could still, each civilization that was capable of producing the simulations could still produce just a gigantic number. If they have, Nick Bostrom has numbers in his paper about, the human brain takes 10 to the whatever bits to
10 to the 14, I think.
Represent. Yeah, and a planetary sized computer would have
10 to the 42.
Yeah, something like that. So you could
answer to life, the universe, and everything.
Yeah. So yeah, each civilization could theoretically produce like millions or some stupid number of simulations.
Hmm.
But I think one of the interesting consequences uh, of there being nested simulations is that it would be the most likely that you're living in. The terminology gets a little confusing because you either refer to it as the highest level or the lowest level.
Mm-hmm.
I think it makes more sense to refer to it as the highest level if you think about everything being like based on lower, if you have like base reality.
The first real people are at the bottom.
Right. And then you have, they simulate, say they have like two simulations, and each of those simulations simulate two other simulations, and it's 4 and then 8 and then 16. Right.
I think there's
you
there might be a problem there because you run into the problem of processing power, right?
right, exactly. But yeah, the question is, I guess we don't really know how far that could go.
Mm-hmm.
Depends on the depends how much processing power there was and how much it actually takes to simulate to run a simulation.
Yeah. Would you think that maybe in a nested situation, if you do have a chain that expands exponentially like that, wouldn't each new simulation on the higher level be a lower resolution than the one on the previous level?
Yeah, so that's Sean Carroll's argument for why at least the nested simulation hypothesis doesn't work, because the top level simulated realities that would be the most numerous would be the lowest res, and so we would expect ourselves to be in a very, very low resolution simulation. And that doesn't seem to be the world we're in, as far as we can tell.
Well, yeah. Is that an arbitrary quantity though? Like what would be low resolution?
Yeah, right. Because we don't have anything to compare it to, really.
Mm-hmm. Like you can look at our world and you can see, for example, if there were a constant that prevents us from having a certain level of complexity, or for example, if you look at our biology and you see there are certain limits, like don't our eyes work as like a frame rate, right? Like they have their
I mean, I think it would be the parts of your brain that are processing the visual information. But
right.
Yeah.
So there's like a maximum speed, and then you could conceive of a system that had a higher maximum speed. And so then compared to that, we would be low resolution.
Right. That's interesting. Yeah, I wasn't necessarily thinking in terms of like time resolution like that. I was thinking more in terms of like the Planck length and that kind of thing.
Mm-hmm.
But it's possible that all this microscopic stuff that we think we see with our microscopes and the all the stuff that happens in particle colliders and that kind of thing, is only actually computed when we're looking at it. And otherwise it's just kind of compressed and it's just doing enough to fool us.
That would save a lot of processing power, right?
Right.
And so that was one of my first questions is, so you're making a simulation. Now that simulation of the world that has to be incomplete or else low resolution, or both, right? Because if you want to simulate a system in its entirety, you need a system larger than that system in order to grasp all of it. But the universe is expanding and information is being lost over time. So the world now is more complicated than the world in the future.
How is information being lost?
Because the galaxies are accelerating away from each other. that means that there are stars that we can see now that later in our history we will not be able to see, and that will continue to progress until all we can see is just our solar system, and then from there it'll just keep expanding until all you can see is, like, I don't know, a particle.
Yeah. Yeah, I forget exactly. I think if I remember correctly, that only goes as far as our galaxy. Like it won't ever like tear apart our galaxy. Um,
You mean like in our lifetime, or in the
no,
Earth's
like
lifetime?
ever as far as I know.
How's that work? How's there a cap on that?
Well, it has to do with how gravity and dark energy interact. But I think it's that I think I'm getting that right. I could be wrong. But I think it's that within the galaxy, gravity is strong enough to counteract the force of dark energy.
Huh.
I guess I kind of see what you're getting at, because if the only thing that's really being, actively simulated is what we see,
Mm-hmm.
then things would be disappearing from the simulation, I guess, when they disappear over the cosmic horizon.
Yeah. Yeah, let's use that simple example of stars that you can't see anymore. In a future where they don't see the stars, they don't have any way to know that those stars existed. And so when they create the simulation, it's going to leave those stars out.
Right. Unless they've they're a civilization that's been around for billions of years, and they have records of the time when you could see the other galaxies.
Yeah. But you get my point, right? Information is
Yeah.
lost. That's kind of the idea of entropy, right?
Maybe.
It is.
I don't know.
I'm like pretty sure on that one. Okay, so we have a more complicated past than a future. So in order for a future system to simulate the past, it has to be either incomplete or low resolution. So incomplete could mean, like you were saying, it doesn't render the things that we're not using, such as like microbes, unless we happen to be looking at them.
Mm-hmm.
It could also be a simulation of just a single person's experience.
Yeah, and anytime someone brings up that idea of solipsism, like it's usually just really like frowned upon as being really like juvenile and stupid. but
Yeah,
but wouldn't that be the most efficient simulation?
where it's just one person.
Literally just one person that actually has to be conscious, and then the rest of it can just be,
And it's me, right? It's always me.
right.
Capital M, me. Did you ever read Breakfast of Champions by Vonnegut?
Yes, but it's been a while.
It's good. There's a CEO guy who thinks that's true of himself. He's the only real person, and everyone else is just a facade.
Simulacrum.
Yes.
How seriously do you take that idea? Fake Eric.
Well, fake Trevor. It seems ludicrous to me.
Yeah.
It seems to me that in order to have an experience of consciousness, you at some point need to recognize that all of everything is also that same thing that you are.
Mm-hmm.
And so you can't be a facsimile if you're real on that really important fundamental level.
How does that apply to other people?
Other people are made of the same stuff as I am, right? And so
Mm-hmm.
they have to be the same.
Well, you don't know that they're made of the same stuff you are.
Yeah, I do.
How?
This goes back to the previous episode that things that material is rooted in non-materiality.
Uh,
That's true of everyone. That there's an ideological basis for all matter.
mm-hmm.
And if that's true for my own experience, that seems like something that has to be extrapolated to all experience.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I really don't know how to reconcile that with the simulation theory.
Hmm.
That's pretty interesting. I mean, you could say that things being ideas is the same as them being represented in code.
Hmm.
Could you?
So that's a question. So he posits in the first part of this paper that sufficiently fine-grained simulations are conscious. And to me, that seems to have the implication that thinking is consciousness. Because what he's talking about here is the sufficiently fine-grained. He says that you need to be able to represent synapses. That is, mechanics that can represent thinking. And if you have that, then you have something that can be conscious.
Yeah, yeah. I don't think we really know that. I mean, obviously, consciousness has something to do with what's happening with synapses, but it has to be. I think you could have thinking without consciousness. Although it depends what you mean by thinking, I guess.
Hmm. So for not Bostrom's definition of what thinking would be in this context, it's synapses. It's being able to represent the mechanics of thinking, of
Mm-hmm.
like neurons firing and that kind of thing.
Yeah, but it's not just representing those. Well, it's representing those mechanics perfectly for the entire brain, specifically, right?
I don't know if he makes that distinction, but that might be a solid way to think about it. Yeah. He all he mentions is that it is able to represent the thinking. He doesn't mention anything about being able to represent the entire system, but
Mm-hmm.
but that could be a valuable addition to his idea.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question because I'm sure it wouldn't. There is some more efficient way to generate the same thing that's not capturing every single synapse, like that. It's more compressed than that.
Well, so what he talks about in the paper, right, is you have in the brain things that operate on a smaller scale than synapses, chemicals that float around and interact inside your brain that have really important roles and effects on how your brain operates. But he says that you don't really need to go into that. You don't have to describe each of those literally. All that matters is if you get on the scale of the synapses and you have programs that simulate the effect of those smaller scale structures, you don't need the smaller scale structures.
mm-hmm. Yeah, you can kind of just have an abstraction of those.
Exactly.
Yeah, I don't deny at all that you can produce consciousness with a computer program like that. Doesn't Yeah, I don't see any problem with that.
So, a question for you.
Mm-hmm.
If you make a simulation, is the world of that simulation entirely predetermined?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. um, yeah, wow, because I mean, yeah, it's not even obvious whether our current, yeah, whether the reality as we see it, assuming it's not a simulation, is deterministic. So like
Mm-hmm.
to extend that to whatever is simulating it, if it's being simulated, theoretically, uh, wouldn't have to follow the same rules at all,
Mm-hmm.
like laws of physics, whatever.
Oh, how do you mean?
I mean, theoretically, couldn't you simulate something that didn't a universe where the fundamental constants were different in some way? And if you're
Yes.
just starting from scratch, you could run the whole thing. Although I guess then you would really have to simulate like every single fundamental particle. So maybe that wouldn't that wouldn't work.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's like if it's a simulation, then we have to assume that our simulators have the power to tweak it, right?
Mm.
So does then being able to tweak it make it not deterministic?
Oh, yeah. So it's their will that's being inserted into this mechanical Oompa Loompa ride. That's an interesting idea. Okay, so you could imagine that you're creating a simulation where it's kind of like the way people like build a virtual world for a game or something, where you have a set of functions that happen and
Mm-hmm.
take in the input of the character and always react to it in a certain way.
Mm-hmm.
And that kind of world is pretty deterministic, right?
Mm-hmm.
Especially if you don't have a character in it and it's just doing its thing, right?
Right.
And you could also have a sort of simulation where you have a set of functions, but you don't know how they're going to play out. And the way that you find out is by feeding it random data and seeing how those functions interact with that random data.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, you also get to the problem of actual random data is actually pretty hard to produce.
Uh-huh.
Uh, a lot of like in games, especially, like a lot of seemingly random things are generated by like pseudo random number sequences that like repeat after a while, but you just give it like a seed and it spits out what looks like random numbers. But I think I get your point. Um, yeah, it could be that it's following some pretty well defined rules, but it's being given kind of a like chaotic input somehow.
Mm. It's something that you see in nature all the time. For example, if you look at the branching of a tree, on one hand, it's a very simple function, right? It's you have like the trunk, and then the trunk splits into a branch, and the branch splits into two smaller branches. That goes on for a little while.
Mm-hmm.
And on a physical, like literal describing where each thing is and the shape of every single branch, it's like impossible. It's just so complicated, right?
Mm-hmm.
And like irregular. There's an irregularity that happens when you, and that's the result of how you have this very simple function interacting with randomness.
I think at one point, I think when I was in Boulder and doing edibles with Maddie, I decided that should be called a dirty fractal tree because it's not exactly self-similar, but it's like
Yeah.
self-similar enough in like a kind of a distorted way.
Yeah. And so what I'm saying is, if you have a world, a simulation like that, where it's a set of functions playing out across randomness, then that would be a non-deterministic world because you're finding out what happens as time progresses.
Yeah, I think it all rests on how you're getting your random input.
Mm-hmm.
And if that is through some like quantum process that is not deterministic, then I guess it makes sense to call the whole thing non-deterministic. But yeah, this is like an open question in physics.
Cool. Look at us music teachers, right on the cutting edge. So, in such a kind of simulation, then it's not a literal representation as much as it's a creative enterprise.
Right. Well, I guess it also kind of connects to the the reason the simulation is being run is probably because they don't know what's going to happen. Right. I mean, why would you run a simulation if you already knew what it was going to do?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Right.
Totally.
But it kind of gets back to the like chaos versus randomness thing, because chaos isn't necessarily random. It's just sufficiently complex that you can't predict it. But that doesn't make it random.
Yeah.
If you did have actual random input, then that you could probably consider that random.
And so if they are doing an ancestor simulation, then those simulations don't precisely recreate a past moment from their base reality. It's just that they only generate a new experience based on existing or on new themes.
Right. I mean, there probably wouldn't be a way. Yeah, there wouldn't be a way to guarantee that it would be exactly the same thing that happened before.
Yeah.
Because again, why would you do that?
Yeah. and so because it's all a creative process, then there's two sorts of simulations that we can make here. There's the kind that's attempting to most accurately recreate what happened, which is it's still a creative enterprise, but then we can also spend energy and say, well, what would happen if? What if these constraints were different? What if things happened in a slightly different way?
Yeah, that would be the thing that would make the most sense, like the goal that would make the most sense.
Yeah.
Of course, we're speculating on the motivations and reasoning of highly technologically, like even post-human or post whatever they are, beings that we can't really pretend to know too much about what their motivations would be.
Yeah. So then all we can say is, here are a couple options that we thought of, right?
From our perspective.
And so the point that I'm going to drive towards, and I'll walk towards this in a minute, but what I'm going to try to get at is that this kind of simulation is non-distinct from dreaming. Right? Because if you think about what a dream is, it's you're taking elements of your past life, your past experiences, and mixing in an element of what would happen if, and then you're running a simulation and seeing how it plays out.
I think it's way more complicated than that.
How so?
Well, I mean, from what I understand, your dreams are your subconscious. Is your subconscious mind kind of working through things and piecing them together in kind of a weird way? And I don't think it's not as exact as, here's this event that happened, let me simulate what it would have happened if this thing had been different. It's like, oh, I'm thinking about this awkward date I have, and also this awkward date I had the other day, and then also the fact that my car is broken, and you have a weird dream where those two things get combined in a weird way, and then that produces some weird like other effects that aren't, and there's things that elements that seem completely random. There were maybe an event that happened years and years ago that you keep thinking about for some reason, like that. That comes into play.
Yeah. Okay, I take your point. So, but still, let me say that these are two things that do happen when you dream, right? You have your kind of dreams that are like working through something that happened, where you just kind of play it over and over again, and maybe in variations. Maybe it gets mixed up with other stuff, but at its core, you're working through understanding that thing that happened, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then
Yeah.
the other kind of dream is the kind where it's just anything could happen. It's playing what if.
Mm-hmm.
And I think you can have dreams that incorporate both of those elements in varying degrees.
Mm-hmm. And how does that connect to? So you're saying those are both similar to a simulation, to being in a simulation?
Yes, at least similar.
Yeah, I mean the obvious parallel to dreams, right, is the fact that you can't distinguish them from reality, like most of the time,
Right.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, our brains can be tricked very easily.
So we have simulations that are pruned, they're incomplete, and we're taking out elements that we think are unnecessary so that the simulation can proceed, right?
Mm-hmm. So yeah, so it doesn't take up like too much processing power.
Yeah, totally. So we have this world that's kind of selectively chosen which elements are being looked at. Now, wouldn't it make sense that which elements are determined to be relevant to the simulation are dependent upon the entity creating the simulation, right? They're making the decisions about what to keep and what to cut out.
Well, I mean, wouldn't it? It would have to do with what the simulated beings are doing, right? It wouldn't necessarily be up to the simulators. I mean, I guess they could control how much we're able to see, and therefore how much they have to simulate, right? Like they can make it the simulation so that, like, you know, your vision didn't stop at the walls of the room you're in. You could see, you know, like forever. You could like see through stuff and like see through the earth, and then they would, you know, then they would have chosen that, you know, you could see that much, but the way it's set up, you can only see, you know, within the room, and you can't see through solid objects and that kind of thing.
But like they can't simulate the entire universe, right? So they're only taking a particular subset of what's going on and simulating that.
Right.
And so there's a decision there to say, we're going to make a simulation of this particular part of the universe and not the whole thing,
Mm-hmm.
not some other part.
Mm-hmm.
And
of course, yeah. I mean, this is all assuming that the the most interesting thing about a simulation would be the conscious beings in it, which I guess we don't really know, right? I mean, they might not be interested in us at all.
Yeah. Yeah, right? There's a decision. Like they could look at us or
Yeah.
they could look at a rock somewhere.
Yeah, or like, you know, the actual universe with all the galaxies and stuff.
Mm-hmm. So, so who is observing the simulation, and how does that observation fundamentally change the nature of what's being simulated?
I mean, doesn't that have to do with whether they're tweaking it at all as it goes along?
Well, regardless of if they're tweaking it or not, they're still making decisions about what to focus on. And so an observation would make a determination. An observation of the simulation would make a determination and collapse any quantum uncertainty, creating a deterministic world.
That is interesting. Yeah, like the whoever created the simulation, like them observing the simulation would collapse the wave function of the actual simulation. That's interesting. Wow.
Mm-hmm. And so this is also
Yeah.
weirdly interesting because, again, the universe, the simulation that's being perceived is being determined by the perceiver who's perceiving it, right? The creator or whoever's observing it.
Well, Actually, maybe let's backtrack a little bit because I think it's often misconstrued that the collapse of the wave function or the branching, whatever, has to do with specifically with conscious observers.
Hmm. But really, it's
it's
just like the relationship between that and other objects.
Yeah, it's
Mhm.
interaction with other objects. So
Totally.
I don't know if that quite works.
No, I think it does because so by interacting with the simulation, the perceiver or the observer is making a determination about what the shape of that simulation is in at that moment, right? By seeing how it relates to itself.
What do you mean by seeing how it relates to itself? Like
Um,
by just observing what's happening?
so by looking at the simulation, the entity is in effect saying, how do those molecules in the simulation interact, or how are they in relation to what I am, the molecules that make me up?
Mm-hmm.
And that would be a different situation if the entity were a different entity.
Right. Like no matter what they, even if they don't do anything, that's still based on the fact that they're what they are. And
Exactly.
yeah, and any other slightly different entity would act in a slightly different way, maybe.
Yeah, and would maybe shape a simulation that focused on different elements.
Mm-hmm.
And so, in a really fundamental way, shape the outcome by the fact of them observing it.
Yeah, I don't know how much that has to do with like the quantum mechanics thing. It's just that anyone who's slightly different is going to have slightly different actions that they take towards monitoring or intervening with the simulation.
Yeah, totally. But I guess regardless, they're still going to make a determination by observing the simulation and therefore creating a deterministic world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't. Yeah, even if there's no like actual tweaking, you can't really get away from the observers like interacting with the simulation somehow,
Yeah,
like influencing it somehow in like subtle ways, I guess.
yeah. Because if you have, let's for a moment postulate that in order to have consciousness, you have to have non-determinism. If that were the case, then by making a determination, by observing it, they're creating a system that is not conscious.
I don't think that's true. I mean, I don't think that the premise is true.
Why not?
I mean, we don't know enough about either determinism or consciousness to
So you
say
don't
whether.
know that it's true.
I mean, I have, yeah, I have no reason to think it's true.
Or
Uh,
false.
yeah, it just seems like an arbitrary claim to make.
I don't know. It's something that is weird. It seems intuitive to me that has to be the case, and maybe there is a way I could make a proof, but I don't see it today.
That's always the way it would have been.
Yeah. And that's another question. If perceiving it affects the outcome, would you get a different outcome if you were to observe every single instant of the simulation than if you were to wait till the end and just saw what the outcome was?
Yeah, it depends. Yeah, it depends how much you're influencing it by just checking it and looking at it.
Mm-hmm.
And I mean, and yeah, I don't really know if we can make the assumption that looking at it would change it, because I mean, well, uh, at this point we're talking about a very, very advanced civilization, right? So I have to assume that if they wanted to ensure that they were having literally no effect on it by monitoring it, they could do that.
I don't know if that's a fair assumption. I don't think that that's necessarily a boundary that could be transcended by technology.
But I mean, we don't we already have kind of don't we already kind of have things like that? I mean, like, uh, I guess it depends on, yeah. I mean, like, I'm just thinking about, simulations of galaxy formations and that kind of thing. Like those don't really depend on, they're incredibly complex.
Mm.
But they're not going to change depending on if you check the numbers halfway through or something.
Mm. But aren't those predetermined systems, like the first kind of algorithm we were talking about, where it's just there's no randomness added in?
I don't really know. I have to imagine there's some kind of like stochastic stuff happening, because it's a lot. It's really complicated, and there's lots of particle interaction and that kind of thing.
Hmm.
But I mean, it's not even that. I don't think is anywhere close to the complexity that would be required to produce a conscious experience.
Well, so what it seems to me, though, if they were looking at every instant and following along with that simulation, seeing how it relates to themselves, that would be quantizing it onto their plane of existence. And if you have a true simulation, it has to be able to be not quantized.
I mean, I think doesn't a true simulation have to be quantized because it's running on a computer?
Oh.
If you're enjoying what you've heard so far, there are lots of ways you can help us out. You can follow us on Facebook or Instagram, or subscribe to us on your favorite podcasting platform. Leave us a nice review. You can even send us an email at postwavepodcast@gmail.com, or go visit our website at postwavepodcast.com. Thanks for listening. Maybe let's shift gears. So one thing Bostrom brings up that I hadn't really thought about, kind of connects to our antinatalism conversation. Just the idea of maybe the a possible reason that civilizations don't run these simulations is that they see it as unethical, right? Because generating the suffering of like billions of beings.
They were right all along.
But,
yeah, that seems like a pretty arbitrary standard.
Oh, what do you mean?
To say that is like on a fundamental level unethical.
I mean, when you at least argue that anyone creating that kind of simulation should take that consideration seriously?
I suppose so, yeah.
I mean, you're literally like a god.
Yeah. Yeah, it's for you. Everything exists for you. You can do whatever you want.
Yeah.
If you want them to suffer for your amusement, then that's your right.
That's why we have the Constitution.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah, if we are in a simulation and and there is all this suffering, then if we create a simulation, there should also be suffering. It seems fair.
I mean, maybe if you take the idea of like ancestor simulations literally, if it's advanced humans simulating previous generations of humans, then I guess there's really no way around simulating with all the suffering that exists right now in 2020, because it's possible that when they're creating the simulation, they have every basically every problem solved, and they have AGI, and it's like a utopia or whatever. Yeah. I also wonder if being able to create like completely realistic simulations and simulating consciousness will occur at the same time or before or after we're able to do something like mind uploading. Like I wonder how those two things are related.
It seems like maybe it would just streamline the transition.
Yeah, I mean, I almost feel like creating a conscious simulation would be easier than mind uploading, just because mind uploading has this barrier of like just mechanically it's hard to wire your brain up without just killing the person to wire it up like fully enough.
Yeah, transferring all of that data without loss. Seems like a mind-boggling enterprise.
Yeah, and we don't even really know like what it would mean to transfer the data, I guess. I mean, you can do the thing where you basically just double the size of your brain, where the other half is electronic, and then just start piece by piece removing the biological part. But yeah, I kind of want to get back to this ethical thing though, because so you don't think that's like a plausible argument for why most super intelligent civilizations don't create these simulations?
Yeah, I don't think so, because while maybe a civilization could come to that conclusion, it seems to me that it's entirely possible to come to any number of conclusions regarding what would be considered ethical. For example, if you're just creating simulations and just to see what will happen, you don't know what will happen. Some of what will happen is bound to be suffering, and that's just a consequence of the exploration of the playing, right? And so that doesn't make it non-ethical, because that form of existence would never have gotten to happen if it weren't for that exploration.
Right. Well, that gets to the question of like, is it worth it to exist if you have to suffer that much?
Yeah, we've been over this one.
yeah. But it's also like, what is the simulating civilization getting out of it?
Yeah, and then like, yeah, it would be like understanding what their ideals are. Are they striving for like progress at that point, or are they at sort of like a Zen-like state where they have achieved everything that they want, and now it's just play. Now it's just for fun to see what happens. Which I think on some fundamental level is kind of what existing is all about.
Yeah. having fun while you're here.
Yeah. Observing what is here and reveling in it.
Yeah. Well, I think this also gets to the question of whether you could have a universal theory of ethics or anything like that. Like if or at least as species get more intelligent, do they automatically converge to some kind of more ethical, like true like system of values that is somewhat objective or something?
Or maybe, but it seems equally plausible that it could go the other way. Maybe once you have that sort of like life security of a culture that doesn't have to worry about itself surviving, then maybe from that perspective it doesn't matter so much if there's suffering or death or any of that, because they don't need to grow towards a better manifestation of themselves in order to survive. So it's all about the playing.
Yeah. But again, at the expense of conscious beings that are other conscious beings.
Well, because you could value existence by the extent to which there is diversity of experience. And so if you have a more diverse experience, even ones that incorporate suffering, that is a richer world than one that limits itself to only those with minimized suffering.
Yeah, I think I see your point. Yeah. I mean, yeah, and if I guess if it was a simulation without any suffering, it would probably be a pretty boring simulation.
Yeah, totally. It's like Alan Watts says, like, if you could dream anything, first you dream you have superpowers and like big bags of money and you could fly around and stuff. And then eventually you'd get bored of all that. And you'd want a little bit of spice, maybe some like, I don't know, fear of death. And so you'd dream as a world where you didn't know that you were invincible. And eventually, after enough iterations, you would just dream your own world right now.
Yeah, that's a beautiful idea.
Yeah. And so this ties back in with my idea that creating a simulation, since it's an exploration in the same sense, it's kind of that same kind of dreaming that Alan Watts talks about, where you're basing, in part, you may be basing it on your past experiences, but also you're just exploring what happens when we connect these things in these novel ways. And if you have that kind of dreaming, and that's like what you probably live in, then it seems to me more likely that there is no base reality. That it's just like an endless chain of dreaming all the way down.
How do you explain the running out of computing power?
Like on the upper level simulations?
Yeah.
Maybe the simulations become progressively more abstract in the same way that like a photocopy of a photocopy of a photocopy is less and less accurately representing the original experience. And okay, so if you have a base reality, then you have that progression away from accuracy. But if you have an infinite chain of simulations, each simulating another one, then you have an element of reality in each of them. And so that could result in a fluctuation of form that doesn't need to have a hierarchical structure.
So you said each of those simulations has an element of reality?
Yeah, and so this is actually one of the most interesting things for me about the Bostrom essay here. In his essay, he has this sentence. He says, "While the world we see is in some sense real, It is not located at the fundamental level of reality. So what do you think he means? In what sense is that world real?
Sorry, say that one more time.
He,
Whole thing.
he says, while the world we see is in some sense real, it is not located at the fundamental level of reality.
Yeah, well, I think what he means by real is anything that you're consciously experiencing has to be real. It's the whole I think therefore I am.
Mm.
I can only know that I'm thinking and perceiving, and that kind of has to be your baseline
Right.
truth, that just you're having some conscious experience. So I think that's kind of the only thing we have to define as real
Okay.
that we're for sure of.
Wow.
I think that's what he means.
Okay, cool. That's awesome, because if that's true, then that is always the center from which the ideas spring. And so if you have a simulation that simulates another simulation, but then the thing that you simulated is also the center of where ideas come from, then the next simulation doesn't have to be any lower resolution.
I guess I'm not quite following you.
Because there's that question, right? Is it real or is it not? And what you're saying is, no matter where you are, if you're in a simulation or if you're in base reality, you're having a real experience if there's consciousness.
Right. Well, I think what would happen if it was like an endlessly cascading series of nested simulations is eventually you'd get to a level where there's not enough power left to compute consciousness. Like, I think that would have to happen at some point.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe. I guess it would depend on the amount of loss from one simulation to the next, right?
Yeah. Or how much you're able to compress consciousness and still have the phenomenon.
Okay, interesting. So there may be weird metaphysical constants that pertain to how much compression consciousness can take before it's not consciousness anymore.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Well, I mean, I guess that also it related to the question of like, are animals, or like which animals are conscious? Because I'm sure some animals have to be.
Oh, of course.
But like how complicated does the system have to be to exhibit consciousness? And it could be, if panpsychism is true, like not complicated at all.
Mm-hmm. I think if panpsychism is true should be your like slogan.
Trevor is panpsychism is true, Bill Walker.
Yeah. It's gotta be like the 4th or 5th episode you've said that in. Which is awesome. It's like, it's interesting that idea keeps coming back as like a relevant concept.
Yeah, I mean, it would just connect so many different things. And we tend to talk about consciousness a lot, so I don't think it's not really an accident that I end up bringing it up that many times.
I don't know. I'm a hippie. I'm sold. Rocks are conscious.
Yeah. Oh, so one more thing I wanted to talk about, kind of along the lines of ethical stuff, but not so much with the ethics of starting a simulation, but with the fact that like Bostrom mentions that anyone simulating a bunch of conscious beings would be like a god, and that brings up the possibility that we could be judged for our actions and punished, or the simulation could be adjusted somehow. And if we're in a series of nested simulations, then everyone has to consider that, like, they have to be concerned about the judgment of the beings that are like a level above them, or sorry, we have to be concerned about the beings that are a level below them, and that the level below them that are they have to be concerned about the simulators and the simulators of the simulators, and both of those like ethical judgments.
That's cute. There is a hell.
Although I still maintain my where we're eternally looping our consciousness, even in the case of a simulation.
Oh, so
It still holds. Well, just because even a simulation, even if it's even if our whole life is being actually run in the real time in in the base reality in like 2 seconds or something, those 2 seconds are still gonna get they're still eternally gonna happen.
Right, because the form of the computer that is representing all of those ideas that is your life is able to present that information in such a succinct way that it can span only those 2 seconds.
Right. I mean that's assuming that time works exactly the same way in base reality that it works in our simulation.
Yeah. Well,
and that I'm
no, because what it's saying, I think, ultimately is that you are in base reality. Even if you're in a simulation, your body exists as the computer in base reality. It just takes a different form than you think it does.
right. Even if it's a computer within a computer, there's still something that exists in the base reality that represents you.
Yeah.
In some really abstract way.
Yeah. Wow. That's really cool.
Yeah. I never really thought about it.
Yeah, and so in that sense, you could have like consciousness in a simulation because it's all just the form of that one structure, that initial computer.